right, guys, so we have a panel here answering your questions all about neurological issues, cancer. So come up to the microphone if you have a question for this panel. Before we get started, as you're coming up and thinking of questions, we're going to go down the list here and see who all's here. So Kevin, why don't you start us off?
Okay, so my name is Ketovangelist. 6 years ago, I sustained a severe traumatic brain injury. I was given less than a 10% chance of survival. And a long story short, I didn't eat, walk, or talk for months, and here I am, and I work to promote safe and effective methods of neurorehabilitation and brain optimization.
Hi.
Oh, microphones are too close together.
Hello. Hi, I'm Dr. Ann Childers. I'm a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist. I'm an MD. And in my practice, I employ the use of low-carb, high-fat diets. I have a couple of people on keto at least. And I believe that nutrition has an awful lot to do with mental health.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jackie Eberstein. I'm a registered nurse. I've done low carb clinically and also personally since 1974.
Woo!
And I can tell you that my thyroid still works, my brain still works, my kidneys are fine, my liver is good, and my bones are fine. I don't need antidepressants. So I think it is a very healthy lifestyle. It's prevented me from developing type 2 diabetes, which runs in my family, and also morbid obesity, which runs in my family. I was born a carb addict. I know what it's like to give it up and stay off, and it is doable. People can live with this for a lifetime. And I'm very happy to be here. I'm a consultant now. I work with Veronica Atkins, Dr. Atkins' widow, in order to educate people about low carb, talk about his work. I also am a clinical protocol for HEAL clinics, where I work with Dr. Westman. And it's really gratifying to be here after all the years of negatives about low carb, to see people who are interested, to see all of these conferences now every year. I think this is the sixth one I've been to this year. And I'm also really happy to see that younger and younger people are getting involved because the old guys aren't going to change. And so I think this is wonderful. So we need a grassroots movement for thank you for supporting that.
Hello, I'm John Lemansky. I'm an internal medicine physician. And I worked as a hospitalist doctor for about 10 years. And I realized everything I saw in the hospital was mostly preventable based on the nutrition that people were eating. And so I started a practice on my own to actually start treating people before they would see a physician like myself in the hospital. Because by that time, it's mostly too late, or all we're doing is really applying bandages to the issue. And so now I treat clients out of California and across the country. And I focus mostly on a ketogenic diet, but also how to specifically tailor ketogenic to yourself. And because we're all basically different, we have different genetic predispositions, different lifestyles, and so it's hard to apply a one-size-fits-all to everybody. And so that's kind of what I focus on. Thank you.
You guys go that way so we don't interfere.
I'm Allie Miller. I am a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator with a background in integrative functional medicine. I went to a naturopathic college of medicine, so kind of have a little bit of both worlds. When I kicked off my career, I worked for a physician's practice group in outpatient care, and then started my private practice, Naturally Nourished, 5 years ago. And we use food as medicine as foundational therapies. As far as today's topic, I was the director of the nutrition component of a research study at MD Anderson through the National Institute of Health using food therapies for stage 3 breast cancer. And so that's one of my elements with oncology. And with functional medicine, we really look at treating the root causes of chronic conditions. So a lot of customized, unique approaches to a lot of the things speakers have been speaking to today. So you can come check out my table, some of the labs on adrenal fatigue or food sensitivities, inflammation, leaky gut, stool tests. And I have some fun nutraceuticals and tools to help you down that rabbit hole.
My name's Allison Gannett, and I think most of you are here for my talk on keto for cancer. In 2013, I was diagnosed with terminal malignant cancer and expected to live only a year. And I was so surprised that I was still alive, and not only that, probably healthy for the first time in my entire life. I was inspired to go back to school to become a ketogenic diet coach to help people prevent and cure cancer. And I'm going to reiterate what everybody said, is we really have to get away from this one-size-fits-all keto thing, and that we use DNA and we use lab work, and that we also use patient history to really make something special. And that's when the magic happens.
Thank you, panel. So we have two very distinctive categories here, and please, if you have any questions, feel free to come to the microphone. But I'll kick us off with the neurological end of things, because one of the things that we've heard in some of the talks is things like Alzheimer's disease is called type 3 diabetes, very commonly been known that. I remember I interviewed somebody on Live and La Vida Low Carb show way back in 2007 that said, oh yeah, in research circles, it's commonly known as another form of diabetes. So it stands to reason nutrition plays such a powerful role in brain health. And I tell people, if you get no other benefits from ketosis, just the brain health benefits alone should make you want to do it. So how exactly do the ketones help with these neurological and neurodegenerative diseases? Kevin?
Well, yeah, metabolically, thank you, Jimmy. Thank you all for being here. I just want to say that. So metabolically, we're changing the fuel source to the brain. And actually, your brain, you know, what has always been a myth is that maybe Nora would have touched on, is that the brain's preferred fuel source is glucose. That's not the case. In fact, there's studies that show when ketones are present, glucose isn't taken up, and it actually reduces your glucose. So yeah, your glucose intake, and you create ATP from ketones, which is much cleaner fuel. And what it comes down to is we're talking reactive oxygen species or free radicals or, you know, toxins, stressors to our body. And we're creating less of those with this kind of metabolism and more energy. Whereas glucose metabolism is less efficient energy, and there's more reactive oxygen species created from it.
Yes, and in fact, from a psychiatric standpoint, it's very interesting how during epilepsy, there are areas of the brain that are basically overactive, and it seems that the ketones actually calm this overactivity. So although there's no, as I showed you in my slides, there's not a lot of study of ketosis in mental health, but this concept alone is very promising, to think of actually being able to calm the brain down. And I know that a lot of people that get on low carb, high fat or into ketosis do talk about a feeling of well-being, and I think that's part of this.
I think one of the really important things to remember about how you can improve your brain function and why nutritional ketosis is important is simply that if you're cutting your carbs low enough, around 50 grams or so, and it may vary somewhat from person to person, what you're really doing is you are utilizing mostly your body fat for fuel. When you're doing that, your blood sugar is going to be more stable. Your insulin levels are more stable. Your blood sugar is more stable. Unstable blood sugar is a step toward type 2 diabetes, and that often isn't recognized or diagnosed. And one of the organs that's the most sensitive to an unstable blood sugar whether your blood sugar goes too high, it drops too low, or drops too quickly, is that your brain doesn't work well. And I've seen in our clinical practice people with depression, with bipolar, irritability, difficulty thinking, lack of coordination, panic attacks, and a whole slew of other symptoms that tells you your brain isn't working properly. If you're using ketones rather than glucose, a lot of that is going to get better. And then when you think about it, a lot of people spend decades on medications for depression. And in the long run, those medications can have significant side effects that are not healthy for your brain. And all you have to do is clean up your diet. In the typical American diet, people may have episodes of hypoglycemia 5 or 6 or 7 times during the day, causing a chronic hormonal stress reaction. And your stress hormones never go back to normal like that. So there's a lot you can do simply by just changing your diet and becoming ketogenic.
I think there's also there's tons of studies that are coming out now showing how many genes are repaired through the ketogenic diet. And I know Dr. Adrienne Scheck recently released a paper showing over 23 different genes that she had identified that were repaired through the ketogenic diet, and most of them have to do with neuroplasticity. I think, the ketogenic diet is effective for a lot of different cancers, but particularly traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all those diseases of the brain. I think the DNA mitochondrial repair, I think we're going to find out that there's thousands, if not millions, of genes that are repaired from the ketogenic diet.
I was just going to add, nutritionally speaking and focusing on what you are having more abundance of in a ketogenic diet versus not, the fact that the light of consuming higher fat has been shown to have favorable influences on cognition as well as neurological health. And then there's even some superstar nutrients like alpha lipoic acid and carnitine, and a lot of these different amino acid derived compounds and antioxidant derived compounds, which are fat soluble, which are better absorbed and more potent in a higher fat or fat focused diet approach.
So thank you, Jimmy, for asking that question. I think we can spend the whole panel really talking about this, but the way I kind of like to approach it, so from a hospital setting, we focus on glucose management, but what we find is it's very, very difficult to control glucose. Obviously, in a hospital setting, people are sick, but in general, in the population, it's hard to control glucose when you're eating a carbohydrate-rich diet, especially if it's very highly refined carbohydrates, which most people who are not doing a ketogenic diet are eating. And so if you think about, when people eat carbohydrates, they have this brain fog for the most of the time. And then once they stop, you get that clarity, you get that mental focus. Now imagine your brain is actually telling you something by that. So if you're going the whole spectrum of your life eating carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates, you're always in that brain fog. Well, that means something. That means you're having chronic inflammation to your brain. And then you're also getting these fluctuations in glucose, so you're not getting active metabolism of it. When you switch to a ketogenic diet, you have a fuel source that's indefinite. For some of us, it's more than others, but you always have a fuel source. So it's like having a diesel engine versus having a gasoline engine. You always have to refuel yourself with glucose. When you're ketogenic, you don't. And the brain preferentially enjoys that.
Would that be keto clarity? Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Very much so.
So that's the one topic on this panel. We're going to come to you guys here in a minute. I see a couple of people there. So please come if you have a question about neurodegenerative, neurological issues and keto and cancer and keto. But let's ask about cancer because it's a little more tricky because nobody is saying that keto alone is the cure for cancer. Please hear that loud and clear. It is an adjunct to the therapies. I sometimes get called out by people, oh, you said on your show. I said, no, well, if I said that, then this is what I really meant to say. So saying it loud and clear up front because it's an adjunct, and we have keto survivors on the panel here, or cancer survivors on the, keto survivors. Where have I been? Cancer survivors on the panel here today. They will tell you that traditional therapies still helped, and it was an adjunct. The ketogenic diet was an adjunct to that, so not a replacement of. But Allison, why don't we start with you down there? How did keto be that adjunct to you in conjunction with some traditional therapies?
Well, for me personally, I had, a giant tumor that had taken up almost my entire brain, and so I was actually probably days within death when they pulled that tumor out. I don't even remember signing the waiver about going into surgery. But debunkment is obviously a traditional therapy of getting the bulk of the tumors out, but it also depends on the tumor. Certain tumor cells are provoked when they're removed. So what they are finding is if people combine getting a ketogenic therapy before we go into standards of care, such as surgery, that the outcomes are much higher. And Dr. Adrienne Scheck's work with radiation and chemo, she's found people that are very high levels of ketosis before they go into radiation. I want to say that their level of success is over 50% higher.
And they end up using less radiation
Less
in the process
radiation.
too.
They're using fractionated radiation. There's also a program at UCLA right now that's using hyperthermia, heat treatment, combined with the ketogenic diet, combined with fractionated radiation, which is much more highly effective. And you also see D'Agostino, his work with hyperbaric oxygen, combined with standards of care, chemo and radiation, with the ketogenic diet. So everybody's different. And in my case, if I did chemo and radiation, my life expectancy was cut by 75%. So I knew, for me personally, what do I have to lose by doing keto and surgery together? But again, like you said, it's no stone unturned. I gave the 10 primary reasons that my doctor believes that cancer occurs. When we see people die, my clients that don't make it, oftentimes they're doing 8 out of the 10, or 9 out of the 10, or 5 out of the 10, or they're not actually in ketosis. They're not testing and they're not measuring. So really, everybody's different, and we have to make sure to come back to that. Whether it's any disease that we're talking about in this panel, we have to really personalize.
I like that we're talking about an adjunct as well. My partner actually had a pineal cyst and had surgery done on that. And she discovered my podcast a little before then and started doing therapies to prep her for that surgery. And first of all, I was super excited that she was having brain surgery for a tumor, and she looked up brain injury and found my podcast. And then secondly, that's smart right there, having that ability to think and open up the box there, and using that to that perspective of finding different therapies that'll help you absolutely is beneficial. And again, with the metabolism, cancer feeds on sugar, right? And we all know that. And and the brain again prefers ketones, and cancer cells can't metabolize ketones. So we can starve the cancers to a great extent by not giving them sugar and carbohydrates. However, that's not getting rid of the cancer cells entirely.
So, I view ketogenic when it applies to cancer in a couple ways. I think the reality of medicine is that it's not black or white. Everything's kind of gray, and so we're learning more and more about the benefits of different modalities and how they apply to different diseases. And specifically with cancer, I view it more as you're trying to decrease that chronic inflammation that you're getting from a Western diet. Because part of what we're trying to accomplish is to allow the body to actually use its immune system to help fight off the cancer. So obviously chemo, radiation, other adjunctive therapies help, but if your own body cannot actively fight off the cancer, and a lot of times you get quite a bit of side effects from the treatment itself, and a lot of people will die just from the treatment. So I think decreasing that chronic inflammation tremendously helps the body fight off the cancer. And then also, I think it helps somewhat with the symptoms. So a lot of people that I've worked with will say, when I'm in a ketogenic state, I do not get as bad of the symptoms that I get from the chemotherapy and the radiation. So the nausea, the vomiting, the muscle cramps, the just kind of feeling weak, it helps with that. So I think there's quite a bit of benefit that we can use the ketogenic lifestyle for that. And I think hopefully more research will come out, and it sounds like it is, to really kind of document that it's actually helping cure cancer.
I just wanted to add, within the keto piece in cancer care, of course, is the fasting tool that we're seeing really promising research on with autophagy, the cellular ability to basically recycle and eat away at the dysfunctional parts of the cell and start from scratch. And that's a huge piece that becomes significantly more successful when you're fat adapted. Like stated, tolerance and treatment for sure is huge because there's the muscle sparing influence of the ketogenic diet. And cachexia is, of course, one of the #1 leading causes of death from complications from treatment with chemotherapy and radiation. So supportive as an adjuvant treatment. But the fasting is definitely a tool that we're seeing, especially post-chemotherapy, to help cellular reset and really detoxification support.
Dr. Atkins treated cancer patients for decades with a variety of modalities, but his main treatments were targeted to strengthening your immune system.
Yeah.
And your immune system failed once. That's why you got cancer.
Right.
And so what we would get into with our patients then going back to their other doctors or their oncologist is, well, you don't have to worry about diet. You have a serious illness, you're stressed, the comfort foods are fine. And we all know what comfort foods are. They're usually the things we don't want to eat when you're on a ketogenic diet. So if you ever find yourself in that position where you're getting mixed messages, I know if I was ever in that position, it wouldn't be a mixed message for me. I would know that I need to be very, very ketogenic and stay off of all the junk. When your body is that assaulted by a serious illness and you are physically and emotionally stressed, what your body needs to do is build itself back up so you can fight your disease, including your immune system. So you need nutritionally dense foods, you need whole, minimally processed foods, you stay away from as many chemicals as you can so that you don't assault your body further. And so again, it's like if I found myself with diabetes, I would not listen to the American Diabetes Association. So I wouldn't listen to my oncologist as far as advice about diet either. So keep that in mind. There's nothing good about eating junk food when you have a serious illness.
I just want to add a really funny story. How many people have dealt with a family member with cancer in the audience? Quite a few. And you're going through treatment and you feel terrible and they bring you Haagen-Dazs, right? And you're in the middle of chemo, and how many people have had a relative say, I just want a grilled cheese. When my tumor was growing, it took over my cravings. I was eating organic. I'm an organic farmer, and I was doing all these amazing foods that I was eating. My husband knew something was really wrong, not just when I burned the bacon, but when I called him and I was at Long John Silver's. And he was like, what are you doing? And I was like, I don't know. I just wanted a Coke and some fried fish and crappy vegetable oil. And he was like, what? So the tumors actually take over our bodies and tell our bodies what to eat. I really firmly believe that. I've seen it in myself and many other of my clients.
All right, so let's get to some of the questions. Go ahead, sir, or ma'am, I can't see. Step up to the microphone so we can hear you.
There you go. I have two parents, both with one of them passed away with dementia and Parkinson's. End-stage Parkinson was her diagnosis at death. With dementia, they say that you already have tangles if you're predisposed to having dementia. Will a low ketogenic diet help with those tangles that are allegedly already there?
Allegedly.
Well, I don't know. I'm a lay person.
Anybody want to grab
I just saw the most amazing presentation on Alzheimer's 2 weeks ago at Low Carb San Diego. So it's not my specialty, but the presentation's gist was this. I mean, I'm ApoE4, which would say that I'm predisposed to Alzheimer's. But I really firmly believe that the best gift I was given as cancer was to be ketogenic, because the research shows if you eat ketogenic correctly for your DNA and your lab work, that you actually can prevent the tangles. And they also showed in the way that we consider diabetes as insulin resistance for the body, they are saying, now dementia and Alzheimer's is insulin resistance of the brain. And what they showed is these people, even with mild to medium onset dementia, they actually fed them exogenous ketones or MCT oil, I think it was C8 and C10, and these people woke up from their Alzheimer's, because what it is their brains, they're showing the dura, is actually not letting glucose into the brain. So the entire body is filled with glucose, but the brain is being starved, which leads to a chain of events that cause the tangles. That was my take from the presentation. So while you might not be able to unravel tangles that have already occurred, which is why we're all here doing this now, because I don't want to die of Alzheimer's. And so I think you absolutely can prevent it by getting on it early.
And just a side note, on Alzheimer's, the only way to really diagnose Alzheimer's is by doing an autopsy. So we use that word, pretty frequently. But in the hospital setting, we'll do MRIs of the brain for anybody. If they have a headache, they get an MRI, which kind of talks about the healthcare crisis that we're having in America and the costs that are going up. But in all those MRIs, the majority of people will have evidence of dementia. And it'll be in the form of more of a vascular dementia, which is also highly correlated with very poorly controlled blood sugars. So in the patients that have very poorly controlled blood sugars, cardiac disease, inevitably they're going to have forms of vascular dementia. So to answer your question in terms of going backwards and getting rid of some of those tangles, I don't know the answer to that. But I think the point is that we're trying to prevent that. And so the younger you are, the younger you start, and you prevent this chronic inflammation that is affecting the brain, the less likelihood you're going to get dementia later on in life. Obviously, there's genetic predispositions, as mentioned, so some people have to be even stricter in terms of what they do.
Thank you.
To add to some of the unanswered questions, there are some people who, as they age and then on autopsy, have found out that they had the tau protein, which is one of the markers of Alzheimer's. They had the neurofibrillary tangles, yet they never had dementia. They never had Alzheimer's. So the question is, why? They have the pathology, why didn't they get the disease? So, and again, this is just my thought process, not based on maybe a little bit of an educated thought process, but what Alzheimer's is also associated with type 2 diabetes and obesity, and we know that poor diet, insulin resistance, dysfunction of blood sugar regulation, which will happen in the brain in Alzheimer's, is also going to be more likely to happen to people who have type 2 diabetes and obesity, and oftentimes they got that way because of their diet. And again, if you can decrease the inflammation, perhaps you don't get the actual dementia even though you have the pathology. And all that still remains to be seen in research. But if I had that genetic predisposition, I wouldn't wait until they figured that out. I would be on a ketogenic diet and stay on a ketogenic diet, and then there's only so much you can do to prevent Alzheimer's, and that is one thing that we think may actually do it.
From a psychiatric standpoint, when you're treating someone with Alzheimer's, a lot of times you are also working with the family. And they have a vested interest in how their loved one does and how well they function, because it could make the difference between being in home or being out of home. And I was fascinated. Dr. Mary Newport talked about her journey And you can find this online. What if there was a cure for Alzheimer's? And it's very interesting to me that a lot of families will not pick up on ketogenic diet. They may think that that's out of bounds. The doctor may not agree. You could end up going through a lot of hurdles. But one of the areas that I thought Dr. Newport brought up, and as far as I know, they never went ketogenic, is that there are some fats that can promote ketosis in the brain. And one of this is the medium chain triglycerides in coconut oil. And what she did is she gave her loved one, her husband in this case, who had very early Alzheimer's, 2 tablespoons of coconut oil, which provide the same amount of medium chain triglyceride as was in the experimental medicine that her husband could not qualify for because he was too ill. And she shows the clock. The initial clock that he drew was very disorganized. And then she shows 2 weeks later, which was amazing, amazing difference in the clock he drew the first time and the clock he drew the second time. And then I think at about 37 days, please look into this. This might be an easy thing. It's not going to be a fix, but it may help a family to be more acceptant of some kind of approach that may give this person some relief.
I really appreciate that you brought up that that aspect of what we can do without the drug companies, and you know, the misinformation that we're all being fed is so tied into what is profitable for companies, you know, and things that you can do on your own. For example, 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. That doesn't make drug companies money. That doesn't like get people taking a pill. Not one pill, one treatment, you're done, but treatment for the rest of your life. So it's like they're trying to prolong treatment rather than get you better. And so, which is why events like this really are so helpful at educating people on what can actually be done. My understanding, to bring it back to the tau tangles and the Alzheimer's, is tau tangles are a marker. We all have tau proteins in our brains, and usually when we sleep, those get cleaned out because we're brainwashed every night. But really we are. We wash our brains every night. And as far as those, why do we have tau proteins, sometimes tangles, but they don't show up as dementia or Alzheimer's? And I think that's it to be seen. But as you were saying, you know, inflammation, we can all do well with less inflammation in our lives.
Thank you, panel. And we have another question. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Actually, you've already answered my question to a certain degree. I'm a nurse. I work at a small clinic in southern New Mexico that serves a homeless and uninsured population. And as you might imagine, we have a lot of patients with mental health issues. As you also might imagine, there's a budget constraint. And so I'm looking for practical suggestions of how to, 1, appeal to these patients, and 2, get them the help that they need starting on a ketogenic diet. And one thing that was mentioned just now is a couple of tablespoons of coconut oil, which is something that we can certainly keep at the clinic and make available. If there's anybody else who has any other suggestions, I'd appreciate it.
No, okay. So I can kind of talk a little bit about this. So I worked for about 5 years in Jackson, Mississippi, and I went there specifically because it's the hotbed of what we're talking about here. It's really always #1 in the nation in terms of all the chronic medical illnesses. And the question you bring up, I'm just going to repeat it because I think it's hard for some people to hear, is basically in a low socioeconomic situation, what is it that you can do to basically change the perception of nutrition? And what are some practical ideas? So one of the things that we did is myself and a chef went to different communities. And for those of you who don't know about Jackson, Mississippi, it's one of the poorest in the country. And part of the problem is, one, obviously, poverty, but the other is also education. And so far as that some people have never cooked anything in their life. And so one of the things that would be beneficial is to have kind of community outreach groups, which would be a combination of a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a functional medicine person, and somebody who can actually cook food, like a chef, and show how easy it is to actually prepare a ketogenic meal or something that contains whole products. So, because part of the issue also is not just they cannot go ketogenic, is that the quality of the food that they are consuming is horrible. It's always fast food, it's food stamp based nutrition, that if you can show very simple ideas on how to make meals that are healthier and cost effective, I think that would be a start. I think it's a huge problem that needs to be addressed, but I think that would be at least a start.
You know what my farmer's market does is they double the benefits at the farmer's market. So they can take the money that they get for food stamps, for example, and they get twice as much. So it's they can buy grass-fed beef with that.
Do you know Dr. Kelly Brogan's work?
I'm not familiar.
Google Dr. Kelly Brogan and look at her YouTube videos. She has an online program, and my sister is a social worker and serves low-income people with mental health issues. And she signed up for the online program herself, and she is now using what she learned to implement with her low-income clients. And she's actually helping herself get off antidepressants and onto a form of, I would call it an autoimmune paleo diet. But on Dr. Kelly Turner's website, she also shows you how to do it on food stamps. It's pretty cool.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Dr. Kelly Brogan, sorry.
Turner is her alter ego. So
no, I'm switching up people.
Next question, please.
Hi, I have a question about my brain. About 18 years ago, I was diagnosed with idiopathic hypersomnia, or narcolepsy. I found keto about a year ago, and I have found when I stay pretty strict keeping a keto diet, my sleep episodes are farther and fewer in between. So I'm just wondering, with all the studies done on epilepsy and some of the other neurological disorders, if keeping ketogenic helps people with narcolepsy as well.
I'll try to answer that. At the Atkins Center, we would get some people with narcolepsy. And oftentimes there were people who were thin. They didn't come because they were overweight. But what we found was, yes, it does, but they had to be very, very strict. If they deviated, then, that was the experience.
If I deviate, I go right back into
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And we also found that with our seizure patients, too. So if you really want to deal with your narcolepsy, you really have to know that you're going to have to stay very strict.
So there is definitely a ketone connection between, for me, for my condition.
Well, I think being ketogenic, yeah.
Okay.
Whether it's related also to dysfunction of blood sugar. We would also, in those people, even though they were thinner, we did 5-hour glucose and insulin tolerance tests on almost all of our patients. And we often found very disrupted blood sugar, even though they were thin. So again, you can't tell by looking at someone whether they have a normal blood sugar or not.
Okay, thank you.
I would also say from experience, and I think many people here experience greater clarity from ketosis, keto clarity, but the idea of having that clarity and adjunct therapy for yourself is meditation and mindfulness as you're going to bed to really calm your mind, because oftentimes it's perseverating thoughts that will keep you up for a long time. But I'm not sure if that's your condition, but that's what I got for you.
Thank you. We got time for 2 more questions, so next up.
Hi. So today we've talked a lot about the importance of a well-formulated and individualized ketogenic diet, sometimes even taking into account your genetic profile. But in order to make this more scalable and accessible to a greater population, that's not always possible, especially in lower socioeconomic settings. So I was wondering if anybody has reservations about prescribing a ketogenic diet, if you know that it's not necessarily going to be with the highest quality ingredients, not grass-fed beef or eggs, and what you would be most concerned about.
Was that a question about neurological or cancer? I didn't hear the question.
Well, I guess she was saying, would it be okay to do ketogenic if you couldn't have grass-fed and organic, right? Is that kind of what I was hearing?
Right, or operating under the principle of first do no harm if you don't, if you're opening a can of worms that...
Right. Well, we need to talk about what we're talking about. All-cause mortality is obviously probably the biggest concern. You're certainly going to address many conditions by having a ketogenic diet. I mean, I've actually seen it on the internet. Here's how I do ketogenic at McDonald's. It is out there. When it comes to certain things that are very specific that are sensitive to toxins, like cancer, maybe Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, some other neurological disorders, then I do think the quality of the ingredients is really important. But you can use EWG, Dirty Dozen, Clean 15. Are you familiar with that? So if you do EWG's website, you can see which the most toxic-laden vegetables and meats are, and you can avoid those and buy those that are organic. And that's one of the tricks you can do on food stamps, for instance. And then there are certain things that are conventional that have less toxins in them. But it really depends on the person. I mean, when we do DNA testing, if you have CYP2D6 and you have the inability to process toxins, and then you have that conventional meat that is laden with hormones and toxins, the growth hormones that are given to cows to increase milk production and also increase fatty meat production also fuel cancer cells. So it really depends that's why the genetics come into play so much, and that's why one person could get cancer eating conventional meats and the other person can't, and it's usually due to those genes.
I'd like to make another comment as well. I agree with that. And I just want to say that in my population, I used to work for Clackamas County in Oregon, and we had a lot of poor people. And one of the things we had to do for people who wanted to go on low carbohydrate diets is try to find cheaper sources of protein. And it turns out that eggs are 100% biological availability protein. I mean, they're really good. Plus they have choline, which is something that is not very common in the American diet. We don't eat liver much, so choline is an excellent brain food. The other part of this too is that when you're eating protein is 4 calories per gram, but fat is 9 calories per gram. So if you supplement with that, like with butter, something like this, you can actually get some cheaper fats in there and still make your daily calorie counts. You just have to be really creative with it. The other thing that we have in Oregon is Harvest Share. And there are a lot of people that are taking their excess organic vegetables and they're being basically filling up the carts of people on food stamps in church parking lots. And that's another great place and just say, have that leafy green vegetable and pour on the butter and enjoy that.
And get your own backyard chickens. They're amazing.
And your backyard garden.
Yes. We have time for that one more question.
No one in my family has been diagnosed with diabetes, but I think we would be an interesting genetic case study. I'm wondering about the hereditary element of all of this. My mother has several forms of neuropathy, peripheral neuropathy, throat neuropathy, retinopathy. She's been to the Mayo Clinic 3 times. It's never occurred to them that she might have an insulin issue. In fact, on the contrary, because she's also underweight, they're recommending she eat things like cinnamon rolls smothered in frosting. My siblings and I are all following behind my mother, about 20 years behind her, with similar symptoms of peripheral neuropathy. And so I'm wondering about the hereditary element, but also my brother battled a case of West Nile last year, and it seemed that that case of West Nile accelerated his neuropathy symptoms by about 10 years in a matter of 6 weeks. So wondering about the hereditary element as well as West Nile complicating things.
Panel?
Well, in terms of West Nile, obviously it's a dramatic stressor on your nervous system. So that would exacerbate any type of neuropathy that you have. The way I kind of approach it is we like to say genetics plays a large role in our medical diseases, and I do believe it does. But I also think that if you look at like your parents, I can't see you, so I don't know how old you are, but if you look at your parents' generation, they probably had about 40 years or 50 years of good nutrition, right, before we adulterated our nutrition. So their onset of symptoms is going to be much later than yours. I'm assuming your 40s, 50s?
50.
50, okay. And then somebody like me, I'm in my late 30s, I'll start showing symptoms a lot sooner because, not me specifically, but somebody my age has probably been eating poor nutrition for the most of their life. And in the hospital setting, what's really scary for me is that I've seen people used to have heart attacks in their 60s, 70s. In Mississippi, you see people in their 20s and 30s having heart attacks because really since birth and even in utero, they're being fed absolute garbage. And so if you think about it, they've had 30 years of absolute poor nutrition, and so they're presenting much sooner. So I think probably, I can't answer your genetic question, but I think you might be presenting a little bit sooner because you've had inflammation in your system for probably the majority of your life.
I would add, as far as, I think we're kind of alluding to this concept of epigenetics, right? So this is what lives above our genetic code, and these SNPs, these kind of sexy things that we're learning about in cutting edge research, give us these polymorphisms or mutations, which can be a lock key mechanism, a code to our genetic predispositions. But what lies over is our pathology expression is our stress, our diet, right? All of those environmental cues. And upon my cancer research for the study that I did, we saw a lot of interesting trends where adoptive parents and their children had stronger correlation of disease than actually the hereditary. And so that speaks so much to the environment and the lifestyle factors of disease over genetics. So that's just kind of that's my way of putting my patient back in the driver's seat of the vehicle of their car versus holding onto the bumper and being dragged by it, right? So it's, you have a role within that predisposition. With that being said, connecting to a higher fat, low carbohydrate diet and lifestyle, we know that carbohydrates deplete B vitamins, right? And we know that stress depletes B vitamins, but carbohydrates actually deplete minerals and B vitamins. Chromium gets depleted. We see very low B12. We see low biotin. These are things that are trending with deficiency to drive neuropathy. And so by consuming nutrient-dense sources of B vitamins, liver being my favorite recommendation, and a lot of the bioavailable forms in your animal proteins, and then supplementing the diet with quality fats. Not only are we reducing the damage of elevated blood sugar, which does demyelinate and kind of wear aggressively at the nervous coating sheath, but we're actually able to, in some level, regenerate and protect that myelin sheath and reduce the symptomology based on getting higher nourishment and less destructive nutrients in our body.
We are all out of time, guys, so thank you so much. Thank you, panel.